We'll now move on to our last speaker of the open sessions of the conference. I hope you're enjoying the day so far. I'm very pleased to introduce Alison Robinson, who will be talking about environmental and sustainable practices in research and innovation. Alison is the Deputy Executive Chair and Director of Corporate Affairs at NERC, the National Natural Environment Research Council, and also a leading light in UKRI's environmental sustainability work. She has, in 2021, she led the Science and Innovation Day at COP26 for the UK Presidency. Before joining NERC, Alison set up the Legal Ombudsman, a national complaints organisation, and started out as a lawyer in Australia some years ago before moving to work with Bangladesh NGOs, promoting disability rights and preventing domestic violence. Alison, it's so great to have you with us here today, and my apologies for putting you in a challenging slot of just before lunch, but I know that people are really interested to hear what you have to say today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. Delighted to be here. I'm listening with great interest to Peter and Elizabeth before that, and really interesting. I think this might be a rather different kind of close and talk, because I don't think I can offer you the wonderful depth and breadth of thoughtfulness that Peter's there. Hopefully, when we come back and talk to you again in a couple of years, we'll be more at that stage. But I wanted to come and talk today about environmental sustainability, and particularly how that comes within the research and innovation endeavour. It's I think fits very nicely with the themes of this conference and the overall theme of research integrity, because really it is another aspect, so I think, where we have to be very thoughtful about how we promote very strong research and innovation, and this is another aspect of how we should do that, and sits very neatly along all the ethical and kind of social sustainability aspects from my point of view. But I guess what I wanted to outline today was a bit of an introduction, particularly from what we're trying to do at UKRI and working with the sector in terms of environmental sustainability. So I guess the place to start is we're very much motivated by this at NERC and across UK Research and Innovation as an organisation, that we fund all this amazingly brilliant science that is, and as happened at COP last year, tells us about what we need to listen to and how we should be factoring in research and innovation into how we act to achieve more environmentally sustainable outcomes, and particularly if we want to both achieve net zero and mitigate, in this case, carbon, but also think about how we adapt to a changing climate and the broader environmental sustainability challenges that we all face, including but not limited to biodiversity loss. In 2020, UK Research and Innovation set out a series of commitments around that, committing us as an organisation to reaching net zero by 2040, but also committing us to working with the research and innovation sector about how we could place environmental sustainability more in the heart of how we do research and innovation, in addition to the kind of research and innovation that people put their time and effort in and we fund. So it's sort of shifting the gears from research questions to that kind of operationalising of what we've learned from that research into how we all work together. So I guess I quite like Peter's introduction of why you should listen to me today. I quite hope that what I can offer you will be some food for thought, I guess. We think about this in three ways. One, how we'd like to invite researchers themselves to think about this. how we'd like to work with other institutions, because actually some of this is very structural and requires that systems change to really make a difference. And then I'll also touch on how we are hoping and beginning work with other research funders so that there is a shared approach in this area. Apologies, we had some plumbing work happening today. It's a bit of an emergency, so if you can hear the banging in the background, I really do apologise. So let me start. I've started with UKRI's commitments to reaching net zero as an organisation, but also more than carbon. We do know a little bit about in UKRI what our environmental impacts are, and it's quite a diverse range of impacts because we're very big energy user, for instance. STFC, the Science and Technologies Facilities Council, and the Natural Environment Research Council use a lot of energy, whether that's for large lasers, synchrotrons, ocean-going research vessels, atmospheric aircrafts. We've got some really practical questions about how we do that research, which is often very important for things like climate science as well, but do them in a more sustainable way. Our colleagues in medical research have some different but equal challenges, including much about the use of plastic and waste, as well as the same carbon and energy challenges. And for those of you in the social sciences and other disciplines, you'll know that we all share challenges around how we use digital and long-term data sets and the questions that throws up as well. So there's a lot of practical questions in here about what we can do. We have started looking across the whole research and innovation sector in the UK. And actually what we can conclude is that very little is actually known as a totality. Some universities are really great at this, some research institutions are really great at this. So I'm by no means disregarding some very good practice across. But as a totality of a research and innovation sector, we don't have a really good handle on our environmental impacts as a totality, or how we might want to work together and share the data and information that would help us both understand the scale and types of impacts, but then also work together to figure out what we might do about them. So there's definitely some room for us all joining up here. We also, as a sector, have, I think, some conversations to have. For those of you who are in the world of environmental sustainability, unfortunately, it does come with a bit of jargon. I think it's much easier for us all that work in organisations to grapple with what we call our Scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is our directly owned, the things we know about, the things we do day to day, and how we might manage them. It's a very great interest to us as a funding organisation about how we get a shared handle on what we call Scope 3. So in the case of UKRI, to give you an example, where we offer funding for other people, and then to understand the impacts and the environmental impacts of how that funding is used. Who reports on that? Who should take ownership? How do we decide if we do want to change how we do things? Where that conversation takes place, and who owns things and can take those actions. So there's some really big and important conversations to have in that as well. The other thing, as I alluded to earlier, is that we do know is that we can't just start by asking individual researchers who apply for grant funding to take the responsibility of this for themselves. Again, I'm not saying that there's not some brilliant things that people are doing and people will continue to do to minimise their environmental sustainability in the pursuit of their research. But given that there is often, as we just heard from Peter, an interplay with collaboration across institutions, data that may be open access or maybe not, infrastructures, including laboratories, long-term data sets, and other kind of kit and facilities. That's not always within the gift of an individual researcher. So where do we place and have that conversation about where institutions should do that support, where the individual should, and how those two things should come together. And I think there's a long way to go on that. What we are seeking to do, though, at UKRI, and why it's brilliant sort of sitting here in front of you today and opening up this conversation, is that we'd very much like to work across the sector and with representatives from there to begin that conversation about how we take our learning from UK research and innovation. We have a very nicely placed position in the system that we can ask people to come together and provide some support. And we very like and have just begun a process to ask representatives from across the research and innovation sector to begin to talk about how we could put in place something. It might be a framework or some kind of approach where we agree what we might need to start to tackle this problem and to grapple with how we can, in a systematic and organised way, just as Peter was describing open access, but with a different range of considerations, how we can systematise and organise this so that we both can see what we might need to grapple with as a starting point, and to track some kind of pathway to 2040 and 2050. For instance, in the case of carbon, how we might work together to minimise that use and figure out how to do research and innovation, possibly in new and different ways. I hope it's come through so far in this talk that what we are very keen to do is make sure that the UK remains a real place of excellence for research and innovation. This isn't a question, I think, of asking anyone to stop what they're doing. I think it's a question of us and learning from that research and the wonderful innovation that I know is out there about how we can do things differently to make sure that we still do the same quality of ethical, reproducible, robust science, research and innovation, but just to think about how we can do that in different ways that lessens the impact on the planet. I do think this is a personal view, that the days of saying that what we do is so important in terms of whether it's climate or biodiversity, so the carbon is a legitimate or other impacts are a legitimate cost. I suspect those days are over. I think our own research and innovation has demonstrated the need to act with integrity on not just focusing on what we do, but also how we do it. But I think what I'm sitting here trying to say to you today is we know that we need to work systematically and with support to make that change. It's the idealism could be wonderful, but actually what we need is systems and structures underneath that to make it possible and make people feel like they can do this in a structured and supported way. In our opening conversations around this, and I'll just offer you, we have a few areas we think are the right places to start to explore about how we could work together as the sector. This is the result of just some initial conversations with a range of universities. We're also very keen to broaden that out and include public sector research establishments and other research centres and institutes in that as well, just to make sure we capture the breadth of the people in our ecosystem and sector. But we do know that we do need to have a bigger job about data. I offered you a view that we don't know as much as we might about our sector and how we do research and innovation. There's some excellence out there and some really excellent universities in particular who are very good at grappling with their environmental impacts of their teaching practices, their estates, and their wider infrastructure. And what we'd like to very much to do is broaden that learning out and think about how and where we can focus to understand the impacts of research and innovation across the sector, completely acknowledging that there are overlaps with, of course, teaching and students, the estates and different kinds of infrastructure as well, some within specific institutions and some without as well. So we do need that kind of complex mapping. As part of that, we had some very positive signals, a little like Peter was talking about in terms of open access, that people would like an open and shared approach to this. I'm sure that will open up the similar but different data challenges in all of that about who and how and what, and the burden of collecting that as well. And we are very mindful that we need to be very proportionate and look at how we can do this as effectively as possible, as well as collect the information we need. So some other areas we're also very keen to explore are kind of around standards and ways of working, if I could put it that way to you. I think we will naturally have to talk and agree on how we have scientifically robust approaches to things like offsetting. And this again is where I think that we really do need to listen to our science and articulate a good standard there for us all to adhere to. And I think there's a little bit of work that needs to be done in that area. I think there's some other areas that in that same way where we need to decide where and how we're aiming for together, and to really look at the data and decide on what given that we are the people who do the research and innovation, what we need to pull through and how we need to work together to what standard. And there's been a very welcome shared sense that we can't go for a lowest common denominator here. We need to have something meaningful, but that's also practical and possible, that could evolve over time. The other areas in our early conversations are also the importance of engaging people, and particularly recognising that many institutions that do, and many people that do research and innovation are very much interconnected with communities, other businesses, and how do we both recognise that, learn from the good practice of that, and the parallels of some of that local community engagement and where work has developed in other parts of the education and institution landscape, and what we can learn from that as well. And I think those networks and community relationships are really important in this, and we need to do some more work to understand how we factor that in. I think there's also then a question in all of this about the balance, as I said earlier, between what's the role for institutions in taking a leadership position in this, how do we want to work together, and how does that become part and parcel of the decision making and business cases of where we place money and funding and make the changes we need to change. And then, as I said before, we also need to think as a second step after that about what we ask individual researchers to do and how we support them to do that as well. Just to preempt any of you who might be asking about terms and conditions of grants from UKRI, it is something that we know at some point we will need to get to. We'd very much like to do this piece of work first to understand where that balance of working with institution lies, and where then we can quite reasonably think about things for individual investigators. It doesn't seem right or fair to place the burden to meet any specific requirements on investigators yet. I'm going to say it's not a guarantee we will do this, but we'd very much like to do this piece of work working with the sector first, before we move to thinking about terms and conditions of grants. I think in this there's an awful lot of goodwill in the section, and if you look at things like the Green Gown Awards, an awful lot of good practice there. So we'd very much like to see how we can work together in a shared endeavour first, rather than just going to what can be considered a reasonably blunt instrument of terms and conditions of grant. I alluded earlier, we often are asked too about positions on offsetting. Again, we'd like to do this work to really understand what a good position on that would be. A lot, for instance, of the NERC funded science around carbon and trees raises some interesting challenges about land use and the amount of land we need to do that. So I'll just refer you back to my opening statement of we do need to have a very thought through position on this, and a robust scientific position, I think. So we're open to that conversation, but no immediate change to any policy positions on that one until we have had that time to work it through. This conversation that I keep alluding to, We have got a kind of an early time map out, and we'd very much like to have this conversation. We'll start with kind of a smaller one to develop this framework that I'm talking about, and then opening that up over time. And would like to kind of start and work through it and try and conclude it within the next 18 months. For those of you who don't feel that's urgent enough, I have an incredible lot of sympathy with that. But I think it's really important to try and do this very well together, because I think, given the importance of the subject matter, we very much want it to stick, if I can put it that way, and come up with something that will necessarily be perfect in the first instance, but will help us define that pathway to take real and meaningful action along the way. I'm also very open in that, and it has come up in these early discussions, and I think will echo probably discussions you've had over the past 2 days about how we bring in wider factors into developing this framework. If you think about practical examples like travel and kind of the culture of research and innovation, these will all, when we know, bring up questions of kind of equality, of inclusion, particularly about how people want to carve out academic and research careers, how you weigh kind of the ethical and practical dilemmas that's making some choices about how we become more environmental sustainable might make, and very much want to put those kind of broader considerations and work through some of them in this framework as well. I don't necessarily expect that to be always straightforward or easy, but I think incredibly valuable conversations to have, as this is an area I think we're all going to increasingly grapple with in our working lives and our research and innovation lives over the coming few years. I should also say that there's a few bits and pieces not in scope for us. We know there's lots of other things that UK research institutions do. We are focusing on the UK rather than international. I'm not ruling that out in the future, but just to begin to grapple with this, we needed some boundaries. We aren't yet talking to kind of broader stakeholders co-located on different campuses around. Our very much initial focus is to begin a conversation with as I said, the higher education institutions around the 4 nations, the kind of the peak bodies and those bodies where you come together to talk about that. We're also very keen, as I said, to talk to wider research institutes and centres where much research and innovation happens, but are structured and work in a slightly different way. And again, as I say, we are beginning a conversation with other research funders as well, because I think that is a very helpful perspective to have. And if we can have as much unification of thought amongst research funders, we hopefully reduce the burden on researchers and people applying, but also have a set of consistency, and we can test and set some good practice in this space as well. The next steps for us really are to start to share these thoughts. Just so very, very much thanks to James and UKRI for asking us to come and just begin an introduction to this topic, if I can put it that way, which is not at all for me in any way not recognising the huge amount of work that's happening in individual. This is very much how we bring those individual efforts together and start to grapple with it as a sector. And then also to keep this engagement going with institutions, and we will continue to keep everyone updated as we can and posted. And I hope I'll be saying increasingly positive things over the next 18 months to 2 years, and that you'll all be able to start to grapple with some much more tangible processes and outcomes. And as I said, I was listening to Peter and Elizabeth, and very much looking forward to when we can have that level of kind of expertise, thoughtfulness and granularity, a kind of approach in this space, as your previous speakers have outlined. James, that's all I really wanted to say today, and very happy to answer some questions. And as I said, I feel like I've kind of shifted gear a little on you to close your conference in a bit of a different kind of approach to research integrity and to thinking about possibly a new area to add. But just credit to you, I think, and UKRI for being broad-minded about kind of your definitions and for asking us along today.
Yeah, well, I think your talk dovetails very nicely with the first talk that opened the conference, where Astrid Icon talked about the work that she'd done with the layer on climate change and sustainability, and that looked at the issue on a very broad focus and looking at potential actors in the system. And to kind of dovetail that, we wanted to end with something that was very much focused on the UK space and helping to shift the landscape a bit, because I mean, last year, for example, we had Martin Farley from Leaf talking about what individual researchers can do in their labs, and this time around, we thought for a UK focus on sustainability, let's look at an organisation which is using its considerable levers, as you know, UKRIs, huge public funder, and I think can in many ways help set the tone for UK research. And I think it was very interesting to hear what you had to say about not wanting to dial down into this, well, this will be a compliance issue in terms of conditional grants, as getting people thinking about this stuff. And that ties in with what, say, Patrick was saying earlier about this, you know, there are important issues in research which shouldn't be a matter of compliance, but there aren't optional extras either. They are worth tackling for their own sake, but they also have beneficial effects for research quality and standards and the cultural aspects of research. So thank you very much for that. We've had a few questions come in. Andrew says, you mentioned funding for researchers and considering their scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. Would these considerations include the emissions of the sort of publication or dissemination of research with publishers, whether in, for instance, digital?
Well, isn't that an interesting question? I think I've never seen anyone report on the dissemination of their research in scope 1 or 2 and 3. Scope 1, 2, 3 is usually the way we report on as an institution. So if I use UKRI as an example, our scope 1 and 2 emissions are from things like the energy we use, so think electricity, in our case marine gas and oil, you know, gas and how we heat and operate our estates.
Yeah.
Their business travel, their things like that. It's a very good question, and I'm going to take it away because this is what I mean when you get into scope 3. So let's say we have offered some funding to someone to deliver a piece of NERC research. I'll use NERC as an example because I think I'm allowed to. We don't at the moment ask them to report, as I understand it, to UKRI on this. I'm not even saying we should, but it is an interesting question if you start to think about how we acknowledge the environmental sustainability of the research and innovation sector as a whole. You're absolutely right. These things about how we publish, the effort going into publishing, and that it's another form of long-term data set, isn't it? How we hold these archives is all absolutely part of, I think, of what we should be thinking. But no, I haven't heard of anyone in UKRI specifically reporting about that. But I think it's a really interesting question to add into this conversation about how we make sure that we're capturing all the different parts of the sector and how we think about it. And if we understand whether it is a large or small or otherwise important part of kind of our environmental sustainability impacts and emissions, and that kind of understanding of the materiality of these things, I think is really important because it gives us a bit of a batting order of where to think about where to start. And then as we work through that list, where else we then need to pay our attention to. So it's a really interesting question to which I, as you can tell, I don't have a direct answer for you.
Thank you. I think when Astrid was asked about climate impact of the publishing aspect, she wasn't aware of any data either, which makes me wonder whether it's out there but very obscure, or whether this is something which perhaps, you know, the publishing community could do more to look into. Who knows? Okay, a couple of questions from the chat stream. Anonymous Attendee says, why has it taken so long for academia to grapple with climate change? Climate scientists have been writing increasingly alarming reports on it for some 30 odd years. How can we expect the rest of society to act when our own institutions have ignored the science?
I guess I sit in a privileged position. I think I'm more hopeful than the questioner asks. There is some extraordinarily good practice out there. I don't think either individual researchers or institutions have been ignoring this. I think there has been less urgency to all our actions, and I include UKRI in that. Please be kind to us, because we are very trying to make good on that. But yes, I think there was, and I alluded to it in my comments, perhaps a little bit too much comfort in thinking that the actual research we were doing was making such a considerable difference. We didn't start to think about how we were doing that research soon enough. That isn't a blanket statement, though. I won't, but I could do some big shout outs for some very good practice and some institutions that are really far ahead of the pack in challenging how their institutions are working, and the way that they both put the infrastructure in place to really make a difference here. And so what I'm very confident about is that there's some real excellence out there. That excellence looks very different. Some people are really great at looking at how they, for instance, tackle business travel. Some people are very good at working with local communities and making that real difference in that regional and local way. And others have made a real difference on tackling, for instance, carbon emissions. What I think, and with thanks to James for his kind words earlier, what we would like to do from UKRI is sort of galvanise all that great practice and bring it together more, so that we can all share that and move together. So I do agree in that sense with the thrust of your question. It's not that there's some not brilliant stuff out there. I've only found a huge amount of goodwill and a smidge of frustration, as your question alludes to, about wanting to move faster. But I think there's a real platform there to really move together and make and translate those sort of individual and institutional differences into a sector-wide one. So I'm hopeful, but I'm not in any way arguing with the fact that we need to get on with this.
Thank you. A couple of questions that actually tie in with what you just said. Mandy asks, how can we keep in touch with developments on your projects on this area?
We will. We haven't got there yet. We just need to do a little bit more. It's always in the prep and the planning, isn't it, colleagues? A little bit work. We will then, we have offered a dedicated space on the UKRI website to just kind of open up and do this. We're just trying to tread a little carefully there from UKRI. We've got the place to do that, if I can put, but very much want to make sure in how we do this, we're working together with the sector and just taking, but yes, we both want to keep people in touch in the right way, and will. I think you'll see that emerge in the sort of by the end of summer, autumn time, just as we start to bring it together, a bit more structure, and we'll certainly be keeping people updated, mostly through a website after that.
Thank you very much. Talking working together, a question came through enormously in the chat. How do you intend to work along side by side with initiatives such as LEAF, the Laboratory Efficiency Assessment Framework? Are you sort of working in parallel with other bodies, or are you trying to take a kind of coordinating role here?
Well, we're very much hoping for, yeah, I guess a coordinating role is nice. I'm not trying to in any way, and I hope that came across in my remarks, place UKRI as a real leader in this. I think we're doing as much practical grappling with this as any other institutions. But we also wanted to recognise that because we work across and fund across all the disciplines of research and innovation, that we felt we could offer that sort of coordination and convening role here. All those initiatives, and it's not just LEAF, the other one's about who sets standards for laboratories, who have worked with institutions for a long time on how to make specific parts of research and innovation more sustainable. We're very keen to recognise that work in this framework and how we can point to those areas that we feel work very well in that. We don't really want to pick favourites, if I can put it that way, because I think that depending on the kind of research or innovation that you do, depending on the kind of laboratory situation or institution you're in, what will work for you and the choices you make might be quite different. And as I said earlier, those ways of helping us set standards and kind of really think through processes and changes and operations are incredibly important practical steps in this. So yes, our early conversations about this have recognised a real role for organisations like LEAF in providing kind of that practical thought through approach. But again, we just want to recognise that whether you work in a laboratory or doing qualitative research with people, there's just some slightly different considerations there.
Sure.
We want to be able to capture it all.
Absolutely. Talking different considerations, Sarah in the Q&A stream, would you be looking at or willing to work with other national organisations on environmental sustainability outside of higher education? She notes she's from the Health Research Authority that's just published its environmental sustainability plan, and they're interested to look at how they can work with others in the research environment to make research in the NHS more environmentally sustainable. So does working outside of HEIs come within the scope of your work, especially as there's so much crossover in the research community between the different sectors of collaborative research?
So yes and no is my unhelpful answer, but let me explain that for you. I'm very keen, and the bit of work I've outlined here is aimed at the research and innovation sector. So we are talking, as I said, to funders, research centres and institutes and HEIs, because I think that is it's quite a big area of conversation. Yeah. It's a targeted area of conversation. I'm not the only person working on this, though, in UKRI, and so that was my kind of yes, no bit. But the yes bit is actually, I'm very lucky to work with some brilliant colleagues who are really thinking about how we need to work on this practically. And so I'll give a shout out to colleagues at the Medical Research Council, who by all means go and talk to Susan Simon and her team, who are doing exactly that, looking towards the health sector. I know they're talking to NIHR, I know they're talking to NHS England about exactly that in the practical operation of medical research. It interfaces with these other organisations. Where can they learn from each other? Where are they able to work together to really think about how research practice is done? I know that the MRC are thinking about a research call in this area, but very much about the practical side of things as well. And so there is that work happening alongside what I've outlined to you today. Equally, my home institution in NERC is in UKRI is NERC, and we are also looking to other organisations like Natural England and the Environment Agency that have other practical considerations and are also grappling with this in our area. So yes, we are, but just it doesn't come in the piece of work I've outlined to you today, just because I think it will be a better piece of work, a little bit bounded in that way. But yes, you're absolutely right that if we are going to learn and do this together, we need to talk to broader organisations about how we do this.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. A question that came through in the chat. As we now have author contribution statements, competing interest statements, and funding statements, should research outputs, include an environmental impact statement? Should we be making these direct declarations up front?
Well, isn't that an interesting concept? I'd say yes, except I think that would be a lazy statement in that I think there's, and again, this is where I refer back to kind of this joint work across the innovation sector. What kind of data is useful here? Like what kind of impacts do we want to measure? Because as we know from UKRI, you need, once you do waste, water, resource use, carbon, biodiversity impacts, you could spend an awful lot of time doing this. And I'm not saying that that wouldn't be a valuable thing to do. I'm just loath to start to ask people to do that kind of thing until we've done a bit more of this preparation work around really thinking about where are the material parts of what we need to think about. I mean, carbon will clearly be one of them as our sector, and then how we want to structure that sharing of information and data. I guess having known what I know is I think it would be awfully hard to ask an individual researcher at the moment to disaggregate some of the data to actually put that in a research paper as well. So I think these are places, wouldn't it be brilliant if we could get to, if we can disaggregate the financial data we all work with, I'm sure that we can get to a point where we can disaggregate and use carbon costs and other kind of research impacts in a similar way. We're just not there yet. We don't have the systems and tools to ask people to do that. So yes, I think if we can kind of keep that kind of question at the forefront of where we'd like to get to in this, that it is part and parcel of how we just approach research and innovation, and that we report on it and talk about it as naturally as we do about these other aspects. That would be very much where I would hope to get to. I just don't want to start imposing burdens on people. You know, it's a bit like saying, you know, a hurdle and you say jump it, even though I don't think anyone could at the moment in the way that would actually be helpful. As I say, though, there's an awful lot of goodwill, and what I keep hearing, and as from that question, is people would be very happy to do some of this. I just think we need to work as a sector to get the tools and the systems in place so that we can do that kind of thing.
And that broader question of how do we make sure everyone has the time and the space to engage with this when they're already feeling busy and overburdened. I think, you know, all the different facets of good research practice we've heard discussed over the last 2 days, the EDI, open research, they're all really important things, and as is environmental sustainability, but it's giving people the time and space to engage with those on top of the burdens they already feel, and making them feel they have that time and space. But I think there's a kind of a perceptual issue that, you know, oh great, I get, you know, that even when organisations do provide support, individual researchers may feel, well, that's great, but I haven't got the time. It's, you know, something I say in my daily life, but that's just a 5-minute job, but when do I ever get 5 spare minutes? So no, that's really interesting.
To add to that, James, is, and we know that some of this needs to be thought through, because what might be good to help for carbon emissions could have a trade-off on things like biodiversity. Yes. So I think that kind of guidance and support and understanding those frameworks to make good decisions in, they may not be perfect decisions in, is sort of part of what we'd like to begin to do as this kind of, I keep using the word framework, this joint approach, so that we understand that this is both complex and that we need to provide guidance for people to help grapple their way through it.
That's really helpful. Alison, thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I had lots of interesting comments in the chat, and thank you. I now get the kind of fun task of saying thank you not only to Alison, but thank you to everybody. This is the end of the public sessions for UKRI's annual conference. This afternoon we have some closed sessions for our subscriber representatives. I'd like to thank everyone involved at the conference. I'd like to thank our amazing speakers. I'd like to thank my colleagues at UKRI who worked tirelessly behind the scenes for many months arranging this. I'd like to thank particularly you, the audience, who have made this conference what it is. The level of discourse, of questions, of challenges, and of sort of peer support and friendliness and sharing of resources and solutions and offers to give support in the future in the chat have been really great to see. Thank you so much. I think it shows that you can get that level of interactivity and connectivity in the virtual space that previously we only thought was possible in in-person spaces. So for those of you who are joining us this afternoon, for those of you in the public sessions, this is the end of the public sessions, I'm afraid. We have from 2 p.m. Some sessions for representatives of the 110 organisations that subscribe to UKRI, and that's on a separate link, and if you've asked for one, they'll be sitting in your inbox, and we'll see you then for some discussions. There'll be a chance to talk about the future of UKRI and how we can best support you, some discussions on research integrity champion networks and how individuals and institutions can address allegations of research misconduct. So for those of you who are affiliated with UKRI subscriber institutions, we shall see you at 2 p.m. For the rest of you, this is goodbye, but thank you so much for coming along. As I've said in my opening remarks today and yesterday, do have a look at our website. You can find out more about who we are and what we do, opportunities to collaborate with us, and loads of interesting resources. And please, if you're fired up by the discussions on good research practice and all those many nuanced and multifaceted issues that are involved in ensuring we can all do the best research that we can and be in environments that are conducive and supportive of that, please do get in touch. As a charity, one of our core strengths is in the amazing volunteers that we have, and we'd definitely like to hear from you. So thank you all very much for your involvement in the conference today, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday. I'll see some of you this afternoon, but regardless, I hope you have a great weekend and enjoy your bank holidays next week and take some time off and enjoy yourselves. Thank you all very much for participating in what's been a really great event.